I'd like to talk about a very interesting phenomenon that I've come to observe in recent years, and it's related to all the pills. Now, you probably know by now what I think about a lot of these pills and what they become: red pill, white pill, black pill, gray pill, pink polka dot pill, whatever. But there's a process, I think, that is still appropriate and applicable, namely what I would call pilling. Pilling is basically when you become aware of things that used to be concealed, hidden, that you didn't understand. Basically, when you transition from a state of normedom to a state of being aware of various things. And, of course, there are further divisions. You could say it's red, black pill, whatever. That's less important. But one thing that's happened in recent years is an explosion of normies being confronted with much of the stuff that is revealed in the pilling process. And it's true that, especially in the manosphere these days, but more broadly, not everything in quote-unquote pilled circles is always accurate, and there is a lot of hyperbole, and there's a lot of dogmatism at times. Nonetheless, there's certain core key things and issues that are brought up that are hard to ignore, hard to resist, and basically beg for answers. And what you've seen in the mainstream, talking about the mating crisis, etc., is very much relevant. Yes, there have been people in academia, in evolutionary psychology, people like David Buss and the like, who've talked about this for a very long time. And I'm not claiming that the manosphere or the pillosphere is unique or they never received inspiration from these people. But I don't think it was the evolutionary psychologists who made this stuff big. I don't think it was academia who made mainstream people like Chad Williamson and others host multiple podcasts where they get on evolutionary psychologists, people who are experts on sex and gender, biological difference between men and women. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I don't think it was the academics that did it. Nobody cared about them. They were just doing their own thing. It was the riffraff. It was the rest of us. It was the common man talking about these issues, whether they were right or wrong. You know, the late Kevin Samuels, whether he was right or wrong, he made a splash. People listened. Whether or not you think Rollo Tomassi is correct or not, who's gotten even bigger now because of all his appearances online, doesn't really matter. All this exposure cumulatively has the effect that people are confronted with certain things. Now, what they're confronted with will vary, but there's certain key elements that I think that need to be mentioned. And one thing that's happened as a result of all these pillings and the contact between normie world and the rest of us is that some very uncomfortable truths about the nature of mating and dating have come to the surface. All of this used to be covert. All this used to be subtle and implied. So, yes, men were encouraged to acquire money, status, quote-unquote, be their best. But it was never framed in the sense of, you need to do this in order to attract a mate. In lieu of that, there were all kinds of fairy tales. They would stress personality and being a good person, these things that are important in a secondary sense, but not as important in terms of attracting an actual mate. So the concept of mate value for a very long time was implied heavily, but ultimately concealed. But the fact that there are all these pillings taking place, black pill, red pill, whatever, they were talking about some very unpleasant but realistic prospects when it comes to mating, even if it's not always entirely accurate, really woke up the normies. This is why you have lots of podcasts going on right now who are totally normie, who have to contend, at least with some of these ideas, and the underlying reality out there. Namely that mating and dating is ultimately very mechanical. It's like a job application. And your success, just as it would be with a job application, is related to various things. You need to have qualifications. For a job application, if you're applying for a certain type of job, you need certain qualifications, just like you do in mating or dating. Now, of course, you need more qualifications as a man than as a woman, because let's be honest, women have always had it easier in terms of mating and dating, although they're a lot choosier, admittedly. But here you have these people that come out and then say, well, actually, it's not about romance. Actually, it's not about flowers. Actually, it's not about your personality, being a nice person. Before you get to any of those things first, what it really is about is presenting yourself as a mate with high value prospects for the other mate, particularly as a man. So you need to have your bank account in order. You need to look a certain way, have a certain height, all this stuff. Very mechanical stuff. Very, very mechanical, very mercantile almost. And there's been a lot of resistance to this, right? Resistance in all kinds of circles, streaming circles, normies arguing against it. Because the reality is, whether people want to admit it or not, all this stuff is really, really unpalatable. We don't want to think about the fact that human relationships are ultimately transactional, tit for tat, and certainly not romantic ones, although it applies to everything, whether it's familial, friendship, etc., etc. People don't want to think about this. And this fundamentally is what has shaken up the world. This is what has really got the normies irritated and angry, because nobody really wanted to hear about this. Yeah, it might be the case that academics did a lot of heavy lifting, but nobody was listening to them. It was the internet and the people that started talking about this, normal people who had to deal with these issues repeatedly throughout their lives and interact with women, who started talking about this. And as a consequence, eventually they were heard. It took a long time. The filters aren't always great. But now the world of normies has had to deal with this and confront it. So you might remember, this is years ago, if you've been with me for a long time, hypergamy used to be a boo word. 10 years ago, if you said the word hypergamy, they would say it doesn't exist, it's all made up. And now you have mainstream people running mainstream podcasts just saying, yeah, women are hypergamous. They mate up and across or whatever. No different than what we said 10, 11, 12 years ago, but now it's acceptable, right? And why has it become acceptable? Because there's just mountains of evidence to support it. Fine, they get their evidence directly from academics in many cases, but you simply can't deny it. When you look at the mating market, it is what it is, and it becomes impossible to deny this underlying reality. And there was a shift there too. Originally it was that women are not hypergamous, they're just normal people, they're not looking for men of greater status. And once the mainstream accepted the hypergamy hypothesis, and a lot of them have, now it's become men don't live up to women's expectations. Men are screwing women over because they're not good enough for women, right? So women's expectations, their desires, their needs are still very important. They've just shifted in a new direction. Because before, they weren't hypergamous. This was blasphemy. It was a myth. Now they are. Now it's up to men to man up and make sure that they're doing a good enough job so they can attract women. So even though the mainstream has become, quote unquote, aware of all these pillings and all these things, at the same time, they don't really accept any of the negative aspects of these things. And they remain, just as they did before, quite gynocentric. But it seems to me this is an interesting example of things happening online that have become so massively represented in alternative media, whether people like it or not, that the mainstream on some level has to confront it. Now, it's not mainstream in the sense that Fox 5 is talking about it all the time, although who really cares? But if you look at a lot of podcasts such as Chad Williamson or a number of others, yeah, this is a major topic. And you have streamers talk about it as well to some degree, just because Fresh and Fit, whatever you think about them, I don't have the best opinion of them, whatever you think about them, talk about some of these issues. Some of which is correct, some of which isn't. But there's no way getting around the fact that mating and dating is like a job application. It's very mechanical. Romance is secondary. You need to meet the requirements above all as a man. And the resistance people show, the sense of ickiness when confronted with that reality, just goes to show, in my humble opinion, that we as a species need to live with certain fairy tales and myths. Saying the truth outright can be destructive oftentimes. Sometimes you need metaphors, you need some kind of interpretive lens through which you can see things, rather than saying, well, here's the deal. You need to be tall, you need to make money, you need to look good, you need to do this, do that. All mechanical. But for most human beings, that doesn't work. Most human beings are better off blue, to use the phrase, right? And when confronted by it, they'll reject it. And to the extent that they don't, they have to deal with it. Because again, it's not ultimately the academics that brought this stuff to light. Yes, they were responsible for many, if not most of these insights originally, but nobody cared about them. Nobody was reading obscure papers on evolutionary psychology and talking about it regularly. No, it was the manosphere, for good or ill, for better or worse, that was ultimately responsible for putting a lot of these ideas out in public. And now people need to deal with it, for better or worse. And I don't think they're dealing with it well. Certainly in modern times, never before have the sexes been as split as they are now. And there's nothing to go back to. There's no romance. There's just the mechanical, job application driven style notion of relationships with nothing else left over. No romance, no fantasy, no more myths about human nature, just the harsh, unfortunate, brutal reality. And people don't want to deal with that. As always, thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons. You guys are the best. You keep the channel going. Much appreciated. As well as special thanks to my PayPal donors. You guys are equally cool. Really appreciate you. And if you engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, sharing the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing if you're not yet a sub, be much appreciated. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.